Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday, December the 3rd, 2024, getting near the end of the year. Last month, we had an interesting show with two Silicon Valley writers, business people, Raj Shah and Christopher Kirchhoff. They're the co-authors of a FT shortlisted Best Book of the Year, Business Book of the Year, Unit X, How the Pentagon and Silicon Valley Are Transforming the Future of War. I rather think this may be the favorite for the award because the timing is perfect. Unit X is designed to bring Silicon Valley business principles, perhaps move fast and break things, to Washington, D.C., which is very slow. Of course, we live in the age now of Doge, where Silicon Valley entrepreneurs have been asked by Donald Trump to bring some of their principles to government. Not everybody on the left is critical of this. Even Bernie Sanders admits that Musk might be right to slash the Pentagon budget. In other words, I'm not sure if Bernie has read Unit X, but he's certainly on board in terms of making it less bureaucratic. My guest today, Steve Blank, is a longtime Silicon Valley entrepreneur, and he is the author of many interesting books on startup culture. He's also the founding member, I think he's the co-founder of the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation at Stanford. And he's joining us from the Pacific Coast, just actually south of San Francisco, between San Francisco and Santa Cruz. Steve, I know you've known Raj Shah for a while, and you're all too familiar with this Unit X book, How the Pentagon and Silicon Valley Are Transforming the Future of War. How essential is it, do you think, for entrepreneurs like yourself and Raj Shah to bring what you've learned in Silicon Valley to Washington, D.C.?
Well, that in a perfect world, we could all go about our business and not have to do that at all. But we don't live in a perfect world, and if you believe the U.S. And Western democracies are threatened, then I think it's pretty essential that we kind of think about whether we can contribute to national security or some type of mission that makes the world a better place. I mean, I teach students that more than ever are focused on mission-driven things, whether it's climate change or national security or whatever their passion is. And this happens to be one that's ever larger top of mind for both my students and startups in the Valley.
Last week, we had Stephen Levy, very distinguished tech journalist, on the show. He wrote a very early book about the influence of hacking culture. I know you use this word, Steve, quite a lot. Hacking the environment, hacking the defense industry, hacking capitalism in a way. What does the word mean, and why is it so important in the 2020s?
Well, at least in the context of the classes we've created, hacking for diplomacy, hacking for defense, etc., it's to take a non-traditional look at pretty traditional organizations and designs. And hacking obviously had a very different set of roots in terms of breaking into systems or something else. But for us, it just meant being able to hopefully change the trajectory of an organization or find a unique way to solve a problem. And so we created a set of courses that now have a scale to 60-plus universities in the United States to help the Defense Department actually look at problems differently, called Hacking for Defense.
You've done many things. You're the author of 4 Steps to the Epiphany, Successful Strategies for Products That Win. As I said, you're also the co-author of the Startup Owner's Manual. You've been a very successful startup entrepreneur on your own. Where are we, Steve, in the arc of startup culture at the end of 2024? I mean, countries are obviously always changing. That goes without saying. We're always living in transitional times. But is there something particularly transitional about the 2020s when we're talking today?
It's the same but different, or different but the same. the passion of entrepreneurs, at least the core of entrepreneurs, are still the same. The urge to create something that never existed before. Um, Founders, real founders, are closer to artists than any other profession. They see things that other people don't. They hear things that other people don't, and they want to create things that just never existed before. Um, and because they have the same passion, that drives them from when most of their ideas turn out not to be right and they fail. And so that resilience and tenacity has them get up and do it again, just like a great artist. Most paintings are terrible, most music, most songs aren't hits, etc. What's really changed is the economic returns and the venture capital component of an entrepreneurial cluster like Silicon Valley. That is, if you think about what makes entrepreneurship work in capitalists in the Western world, and including China, is the enormous returns now that are associated with a successful startup. And that's gone from millions of dollars to billions to now tens of billions, and SpaceX might be worth, north of $250 billion. I mean, that's science fiction. At least even 10 years ago, it's certainly science fiction. When I started in the Valley in the last quarter of the 20th century. So the passion of entrepreneurs is still there. The economic returns are just way off the scale. That's different. And then I'll throw into that two things that were transformative. One was the emergence of computing as a utility, Amazon Web Services, and the rest. We take that for granted, that you plug into a wall and you could have more computing power than existed in the entire United States when I was an entrepreneur, at your fingertips. And now AI is going to be, and is changing everything. And really interesting is most people are distracted by ChatGPT and the chatbots, but the real changes are happening in other areas like biotech and materials design and the rest. And so I think we're just at the beginning of something really exciting in terms of what we're going to be able to create.
We're always at the beginning, Steve, until we're at the end. Silicon Valley is always saying we're at the beginning, and then we get to the end and everyone's missed it, except for a few smart prescient people, perhaps like yourself. You mentioned SpaceX. The other side of the SpaceX coin is the decline, or at least the eclipse, of NASA by private companies like SpaceX. Is there an architectural shift, in your view, in the first quarter of the 21st century, and perhaps the second quarter of the 21st century, between private companies like SpaceX, which have the capital, the innovation, the resources, the innovation, the individuals, the ambitious individuals like Musk, to quite literally pioneer journeying through the extraterrestrial world, and traditional state bodies, perhaps bureaucracies like NASA? Has something shifted? Is there still a place for the NASAs of the world, the government organizations in the second quarter of the 21st century?
Sure, but, and the but is interesting. The average age of NASA employees have went from their mid to late 20s when we did the Apollo program to somewhere in their 50s. And I think that's indicative of not only NASA, but the Department of Defense. And those organizations go from usually innovative, organizations driven by crisis or extreme goals to ones of execution of process. And that requires different people, different speed, different risk profiles, etc. And I think we're seeing that in a lot of government organizations. And bureaucracy builds up and process builds up. And in fact, people who manage process tend to dominate the organization versus the innovators who get to push to the side. That said, there are things NASA is still great at, and in fact should probably be focused back on, which is creating science missions that are incredibly exquisite and require detailed knowledge that might take decades of commitment to build instrumentation. As to just physical access to space, that's now, and hard to believe I'm going to say this, but that's now a commodity. And unfortunately, the commodity is dominated by one company, which is SpaceX. And And I say unfortunately because we're always better when we have competitors in a market, but they're doing a heck of a job just driving themselves to be competitive internally. Um, so the answer is, yeah, there's a place for NASA, but I think it would be a much different NASA. And I think given the new administration, we're probably going to see that.
A lot of people are going to be listening and watching, Steve, to this and thinking, well, this is all very well, but the value of government, the value of organizations like NASA is that they're publicly funded and their formal goals are in the name of the public. That hasn't always and won't always be the case. Whereas SpaceX is a for-profit company. It's dominated by Elon Musk, who's obviously a very unusual personality. Some people love him, some people hate him. Should we be fearful of this new age where the Musks and the Bezoses of the world, the multi-billionaires, determine how and when we supposedly escape our own planet, settle other planets, explore the universe?
I'm not sure why that would be concerning. I think the role of government is to do things that that individuals or individual companies or in national interest that we can't do ourselves. SpaceX and hopefully Blue Origin will be able to accelerate the exploration of space and drive down the cost of access to space in a way that NASA's been, visibly unable to do with their investment. And I blame Congress on this, on the Space Launch System, which, that comparison between the Space Launch System and Starship is almost, it's past the point of being embarrassing. It's ludicrous. So no, I wouldn't be concerned. As I said, I would be focusing NASA on the things that aren't of interest or aren't within the goals of these private companies and be taking advantage of them. And NASA has done that to some extent with commercial crew and commercial cargo of basically paying for services to the International Space Station. But to answer your question, no, not at all. I think we should be doubling and tripling down all across our government organizations to be able to take advantage of the high speed that commercial companies can offer.
I don't want to turn this, Steve, into just another argument about Elon Musk. I don't know whether you have a relationship with him or not, but some people are going to be watching this and thinking, look what Musk did with Twitter, which was supposedly the public square of the internet, even if it was a private company. And he's changed its name and he's transformed it in many people's minds into a platform for his own self-promotion. Isn't it conceivable? And again, I don't want to necessarily Musk, but highly successful, powerful men like, and they tend to be men like Elon Musk. Should we entirely trust them? Isn't the point of government to oversee guys like Musk and Bezos?
That's really above my pay grade. I'm whether it's the role of government to oversee Elon or the role of government to get out of the way, I think that's a debate that's still ongoing.
Well, if you're jumping in here, Steve, if the government gets out the way, the old cliche is vacuums are always filled with power. If the government gets out the way, then someone has to step in. Isn't that fair?
Yeah, well, I think, back to your point, the government had done I think as politely as I try to say, a pretty mediocre job of trying to drive the cost of access to space down. And SpaceX managed to do that mostly on their own nickel. I'm not sure what you would suggest is that we kind of abandon that and go back to the status quo. I mean, that really isn't an appealing direction. If the straw man is Elon Musk is a bad guy and therefore we shouldn't depend on him, as I said, I'm not sure how to make that judgment other than putting aside his personality, looking at his accomplishments, and are many and substantial. And in this case, I think a positive for the country, at least for access to space.
Let's focus on defense. You wrote an interesting piece last week, actually, how to fix a broken defense department to beat China and Russia. Is our defense department, in your view, broken, Steve? I
Completely.
mean, Raj Shah in Unit X, I guess, suggests that.
Yeah, completely broken. And that doesn't mean ineffective. That just means completely broken in comparison to potential adversaries. You know, on a good day, China operates like Silicon Valley, and the DoD barely manages to operate like General Motors. And that's just not a fair fight. And most of that is due to our success, meaning for 75 years, we operated like the South China Sea was our private lake and basically had no competitors. Or during the Cold War with Russia or Soviet Union, we had a competitor that operated essentially at our same clock speed. But you know, we built so many processes and procedures and kind of operated like we didn't have to worry about high-speed innovation. That we're now finding not only are we competing with China and Russia, who would have thought we'd be like fending off missile attacks from the Houthis? You know, I'm still not sure most of your viewers could find Yemen on a map. You know, that's a little embarrassing trying to shoot down $20,000 drones with multi-million-dollar missiles. And that math eventually doesn't work. So yeah, the Defense Department truly in need of a major reorganization to operate at speed and scale and take advantage of the commercial ecosystem that is much more effective in building a class of potential weapon systems than the DoD is. And again, almost impossible to do when you keep appointing the same people you would have appointed 10 years ago. When you have the same people, same organization, but you're in a crisis, that doesn't work. It's usually a recipe for failure and disaster. So yeah, I would agree with Raj, and maybe even more so.
It's interesting you mentioned China. Last week we had Kishore Mahbubani, a Singapore-based analyst. He's quite controversial. He talks about 21st century as the Asian century, which he celebrates. He sees the rise of China and the decline of the US. I'm not sure you would necessarily agree with him. But I'm intrigued with the idea that you suggest that China operates like Silicon Valley. You just suggested that. How can it operate like Silicon Valley in the sense that it's a massively centralized authoritarian state? How does it combine the two?
Well, you just described the Department of Defense. You know, it's a massively centralized organization that operates as an arm of the state. So, you know, what's different is that there's an authoritarian government that, you know, that's potentially a threat to Western democracies, and certainly within the countries in the South Pacific. So I think they've managed to combine both their private organizations, their commercial companies, with their military, and have a whole nation approach to national security. Ash Carter was the first one to suggest that as Secretary of Defense when he stood up this organization that Raj Shah, who you mentioned, ran, called DIU. And basically the rest of the Defense Department stiff-armed them. That is basically, you know, ignored them, gave them a $30 million budget, which is essentially probably the pencil budget for one half of the Pentagon until this year. And operated like Silicon Valley didn't exist. We still are organized like we have no adversaries, and we still operate that whatever speed we're operating on is the right speed. It just turns out that's not the case. And we haven't figured out how to get out of our own way. You know, I've made some proposals, and other people are talking about how do we do this in a way that kind of embraces the fact that private companies now are probably better equipped to build things that have new technologies, whether they're drones or AI or biotech or access to space or cyber, are probably better done outside of the federally funded research labs or the existing prime contractors. We need tens of thousands of drones. We don't have factories that even match Ukraine. Um, so I think it's a very lost opportunity where we're basically in our own way and really need to rethink about our relationship to the rest of the country.
You said we need tens of thousands of drones. You also mentioned earlier that the Houthis are a thorn in the American side. I mean, you know a lot more about this than I do, although I'm not convinced that most Americans even know who the Houthis is and how they're a thorn. Are you suggesting then that we privatize the Defense Department so that they somehow create tens of thousands of drones that can be used against annoying irritants like the Houthis?
That's a pretty interesting proposal, and it sounds insane. But actually, we did it in World War II. Some of your viewers might know that just before World War II started, the Dean of Engineering of MIT and a couple of others went to President Roosevelt and said, World War II is going to be a technology war, and that the military is completely unprepared to deal with advanced technology. They're great at building guns and planes and ships, but they have very little knowledge of advanced tech. And he said something crazy at the time. He said, you should let civilians build those. And of course, the head of the Army and Navy just laughed and said, well, that's insane. We have these research labs. And guess what Roosevelt did? He agreed. And so they stood up an organization that eventually became the Office of Scientific Research and Development. And these centers were run by professors in universities that built radar, electronic warfare, rockets, and even were working on an advanced physics program that became so big they spun it out. It was called the Manhattan Project. All that was driven by a radical view of how to take advantage of where the advanced technology and capabilities were in the country at the time. And I just say that as a preamble that in my mind, we should probably do that again. This time not to university professors, but to startups and scale-ups. We should just admit that inside the DoD and our prime contractors, it's not that we have dumb people or we just have world-class people and world-class organizations for a world that no longer exists. And that's a big idea. I mean, the world that we want and wish is not the world that we have. And then unless we deal with it in a way of putting our resources to where our capabilities are, we're going to be unevenly matched. And so my proposal, just listen, one of many ideas that are floating around, but only possible in a new administration capable of making some pretty bold moves, would be to outsource things that startups and scale-ups are better at, whether it's AI or drones or biotech or whatever, and actually have them design and build advanced weapon systems. And it's not like we haven't done it before. We did. And it worked. And we were the only nation that did that in World War II. It gave us probably a 2-year advantage. One could argue actually helped end the war early. So yeah, I think we should take a pretty radical look about how we're building advanced things and where we're building them and who's running them. So that would be my thought. And by the way, we've run prototypes of this. The Defense Innovation Unit, the very organization that Raj helped start and Doug Beck now runs, is kind of a prototype of this organization. They basically have what are called the embeds inside of combatant commands, trying to understand problems. They're building these prototypes, but they have very limited authority and almost no budget to scale these things with the right contracts. They could get demos going or early contracts, but they don't have the authority or the resources to make this happen. If I was doing this, I would pull them out of the DoD and give Doug Beck or Trey Stevens or even Elon the authority to go do this with maybe 15 or 20% of the DoD, what's called the RDT&E budget, and say, go make this happen. And the mental test is, would this be worse than what we're doing now? And I think you'd be hard pressed to say it would be worse than the system we have. Again, not because we have dumb people or bad, intent. It's just we're so wrapped up in the process and organization and bureaucracy that we've created when we were the dominant power, and none of it mattered that we were slow and it took decades to deploy systems at scale, or we only have like 5 or 6 prime contractors after the Cold War ended, and supposedly we didn't need all these other contractors. That's all these things are no longer true. And instead of solving them, we keep, doing things at the edge. I think the new administration with this idea about Doge is, partially correct, that we have lots of opportunities to cut. But I haven't heard any plans about what are we going to replace things with. So when you break things, you usually want to break them and maybe reconfigure them in a more efficient way.
I mean, of course, Zuckerberg's remark about moving fast and breaking things, you didn't always fix them. That's one of the critiques. There's so much interesting here. There's so much stuff interesting, Steve. But what about the political dimension? I mean, your point on the Second World War is a very important one. Of course, one of the other things that came out of all that innovation was the internet itself, that was developed by the same scientists who were unleashed in the war against the Axis powers. What about the politics and the role of politicians? Let's use an example of the wars, the post 9/11 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I think most people would acknowledge or agree that they were disasters for one reason or another. I'm guessing you probably would too. But my sense, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that they were disasters not because Americans didn't have the right weapons or technology, but because of political missteps. How does the failures of the wars, the post 9/11 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, fit into your narrative?
Well, they certainly don't. We depend on the good judgment and wisdom of our political leaders and a set of coherent goals that they have for not only keeping Americans safe and secure in their beds, but keeping Western democracies safe and secure in their beds, and avoiding adventures that really don't align with those goals. And as you point out, I think we failed politically on all those steps. It's going to be interesting to see what the new administration does and how they approach these issues. I have no idea. Again, my test is, could it be worse than what we've been doing? In this case, possibly. I mean, the worst case always is someone miscalculates in the South China Sea and there's a shooting war, which will spiral into something much worse, or someone miscalculates in Europe, where there's already a massive ground war, and that could spiral into something else. I think we, again, depend on the good judgment of the president, his staff, the National Security Council, Congress, etc. The jury's going to be out, and it's going to be an interesting January.
So what's the point of all this military efficiency? Let's use the three hotspots militarily for the US in the world: 2 actual, 1 potential: the South China Sea and the Taiwan issue, Ukraine, and then Israel, Gaza. If America was more efficient, if your principles of startup culture, your startup owner's manual showed up on every desk in the Pentagon, and they did what you're saying at the Gordian Knot Center, why would America be stronger? How would it affect America's ability to shape or perhaps not shape the war in Ukraine, or the endless disasters in the Middle East, or even potentially what the Chinese might do in Taiwan?
That's a great question. And the best answer I think I've gotten is we have General Mattis at Stanford, who comes in and talks to our class often. And he said something which just kind of stuck with me for forever, which he said, his job was to make Xi and China wake up every morning, look at the map of Taiwan, and look at the strength of the U.S. military and say, not today. that's not clear, that is still the answer. That is, the U.S. military vis-a-vis China in the South China Sea, its ability to deter an invasion is decreasing daily. China is putting 15, for example, 15 destroyers a year in the water, and we could barely chunk out a 1.5. And when you look at those maps of, you could run the tape backwards in Ukraine. If Ukraine had a bunch of advanced weapon systems in the beginning of the war, Putin might have realized that this wasn't going to be the cakewalk he expected. The goal, if you have to win a war, you've already lost. The whole goal is to deter at least a rational actor who's doing the calculation about whether they could win one. The trite phrase from the Cold War was peace through strength. I'm not sure that's trite, at least for rational actors. It's not clear that anything will deter irrational actors, and like leaders of North Korea and Iran, or the mess in the Middle East. Those are not basically rational acts on either side. But at least for rational actors who are worried about their own country and economy, history tells us when they view there's an opportunity from a weakened state, they'll take advantage of it. All the way to the top, I just want to remind you and your listeners, the military is probably the worst way a nation could spend its money. As I'm talking about being efficient and engaging the whole nation in Silicon Valley, this is the duality of human beings. We're have immense compassion and immense cruelty, and we've been doing that through the history of recorded history, and probably before, of hitting each other over the heads with sticks and guns and whatever, at the same time caring about our children and our families, etc. The problem is we have bigger sticks and bigger things at risk here. I'm not sure what the right answer is, but I do know that unless you could deter a war, you tend to end up losing them. And so my contribution here is to help us build a credible defense and offense that we could kind of tamp down some of the opportunities that people might want to take.
Although you don't want to just arm a doctor. I mean, you can bring all your principles of efficiency to Washington, D.C., Steve, but if you're arming a Dr. Strangelove, then that's doubly chilling, isn't it? I mean,
Well, the whole thing is chilling, right? I mean, I lived through the Cold War when we did nuclear war drills by having kids hide under their desks, and lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis as a kid when we came within potentially hours of a nuclear conflict. I think as long as there are incompatible systems and people who are unsatisfied with what their neighbors are doing, we're going to be faced with these threats. I'm not smart enough to think about how do we back all this down, which we should and could. As I said, while I think these idea of weapon systems and drones and whatever are seductive, that unfortunately shouldn't be the goal of the human race. I mean,
although if you're not smart enough, Steve, I don't know who is. I mean, if you don't get it, then nobody does. Let's talk about NATO then. I mean, NATO was a military alliance of the 20th century. Trump seems to suggest that it's archaic and perhaps beyond its sell-by date. Given these new realities of bringing a networked startup culture to the defense industry and reinventing the state, or perhaps in some ways even blowing up the state, should that result in a different architecture of American diplomacy in the world? Does that mean that traditional defense alliances like NATO are themselves history, and that America needs to rethink how it engages with the world? Doesn't that have to be a mirror of this radical reinvention of government that you're suggesting? The two aren't simply in parallel, they're intimately bound up with one another.
For me, both for Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, one of the lessons for me personally is you can't defend people who don't want to defend themselves, and I think that's while it was phrased in Trumpian language, I think that is a test that NATO countries need to be asking themselves: is that how committed are they to their own defense? And it's not a theoretical issue with a war going on within a couple hundred miles of some of their borders. Some of them still believe that it's someone else's problem. Again, I just think it's time to ask that question seriously, and I think it's going to be asked in the new administration. If you guys aren't serious, is that what are we doing?
Do you give up on the language, Steve, of the old Cold War or post-Second World War language of the free world and America as the leader of the free world? Are you suggesting, perhaps, like some people seem to be arguing, that if Europe isn't willing to invest in its own military defense systems, then it's really not America's responsibility, which implicitly suggests that that old idea of the free world is no longer relevant?
Well, I think that's a kind of a false equivalence. I think during the Cold War, Europe was committed to its own defense and committed a substantial part of their defense budget to actually supporting NATO. I think after 75 years, I think it's started to, in some countries, be taken for granted. And I think the question that's being asked is that, how much of that is a free ride versus how much of that is as I said, I think we have enough experience between Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan that if our allies aren't willing to fight for their own nation, it usually doesn't end well for the United States getting involved in their own issues. And I think in Ukraine, we're certainly seeing an ally fighting us like there's no tomorrow to defend their own nation. That's a good question to ask the rest of Europe. And I think a fair question.
Steve, your principles are also not just used in terms of American defense and shaking up, or perhaps even fundamentally changing the Pentagon, the defense industry, but also in terms of other national problems like the environment. I know you teach a course at Stanford about hacking the climate crisis. Are the same principles relevant not just for defense, but for all of America's crises, the environment, perhaps other crises? Can America hack its way successfully into the mid-21st century?
Sure. I think the passion of students and young people and who are driven by these, what we call mission-driven problems, whether they're climate or sustainability or alternate energy or healthcare or the energies we could tap into and have tapped into in the past. Our goal in setting up these classes is to give them a process and a set of tools so they're able to do that efficiently rather than just random walks in attacking them. And I think the results are pretty spectacular. They go off and leave and start some really amazing things or end up contributing in both NGOs, nonprofits, and government agencies. So the answer is yes. We can engage Americans and others in using their passion and energy to change the world.
Steve, finally, of course, famous book was written 10, 15 years ago about Israel. It was called Startup Nation, and Israel is a startup nation, a very successful one. But is your vision of America also as a even more profound startup nation? It's not just about developing new technologies or reinventing business and the economy. It's about reinventing America as this startup nation. You co-wrote this book, The Startup Owner's Manual. Should this be read not just by every American, but by all American statesmen to try and turn America into this perpetual startup?
Well, I think America is already in a perpetual startup. The amount of capital available from private sources is, it's unending. I think the thing we've done well, or at least started to think about again, is the role of government in national industrial policy, in addition to the role of venture capital and the role of private equity. I think the last 50 years have been incredibly unique about this intersection of the entrepreneurs, which have been around forever, but capital, and that is money to fund crazy people and risky things where you could never go to the bank before and get a loan for. If you said 9 out of 10 things that I'm going to do are going to fail, you would be laughed out of any bank. But in fact, that is the basis of venture capital, because those 1 out of 10 or 2 out of 10 fund and return obscene profits for the rest of those. That engine is kind of integral to the U.S. But the other part of that that's integral is, we have a special word in Silicon Valley and other entrepreneurial clusters in the U.S. for a failed entrepreneur. Do you know what that word is? Any idea?
Well, failure is always considered in Silicon Valley success. And Reid Hoffman famously said, fail fast, fail often. So I'm not sure what the word is, but
the
failure is success, really, I guess.
The word is experienced. And that's a unique American thing. That is, a failed entrepreneur is thought of as an experienced entrepreneur. You haven't shamed your family. You haven't shamed your village. You don't have to leave town. No one's coming after you with baseball bats to break your knees to get the money back, etc. That's really not true in almost every other culture or country, even in Europe. Again, there are exceptions, but that's what makes this intersection of money and entrepreneurship and culture kind of unique here to the U.S. We're perpetual optimists. We always think that we're going to succeed because there are opportunities to do so. We don't get one shot at the goal. We get multiple shots at the goal. And that's kind of neat about our country. We've always kind of been optimistic about what we're capable of doing. And I want to tie all these pieces together, whether it's defense or climate or the rest, is that if anybody's going to lead on this stuff, it's probably going to be the United States. At the end of the day, totalitarian and authoritarian systems tend to collapse on themselves. It took, the Soviet Union 75 years. China will eventually, the contradictions between capitalism and the Communist Party trying to keep itself in power, that's eventually a failed system that whose time is going to come. The only thing we have to worry about is whether we time out democracy or not in the next administration, and hopefully it'll just be an interesting experiment in efficiency rather than also the end of democracy, and time will tell.
Good stuff. A glint of optimism, a glint of sunshine in what many people see as darkness in America. Steve Blank, co-author, Startup Owner's Manual, a man who is doing all sorts of thinking and not just thinking about making America more competitive on lots of fronts, diplomatically, militarily, politically, economically in the 21st century. Steve, I'll have to get you back on the show. Real pleasure and honor. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.